I hate being around you because your poverty is contagious. Why did I marry someone as depressing as you? Life is so unfair. Give me my life back. Seriously.
I was appalled at my wife, who came home in the morning and said whatever she wanted, and I questioned her incredibly selfish behavior until now. Even when I put the key in the door, it wouldn't open.
I changed the locks.
Why do I have to be treated like this? How much more will she ridicule me until she's satisfied? My pride had been shattered for years, and I made a firm decision. I will never forgive you for this. I'm John Smith, a 64-year-old shoemaker. I took over my father's business in a corner of downtown and started training in the old workshop when I was 18. I had always assumed without question that I would take over my father's work, having watched him since I was a child. Seeing my father work all year round, I wanted to help somehow, so I polished shoes or picked up trash, doing what I could. My naturally quiet personality came from my father, and my mother always looked at my father and me with a smile. When I was 25, my father worked too hard and fell ill, repeatedly going in and out of the hospital. When my father became bedridden, there was no breadwinner. I diligently learned from my father and continued my training. My mother devoted herself to caring for my father, and my earnings barely kept us afloat. We never had any extra. So I thought I had to keep pushing myself. At 28, someone I worked with introduced me to a woman for a possible marriage. My father had passed away a year earlier, so it was just my mother and me. You should settle down soon, my mother encouraged, so I agreed to meet her. The woman was a bright and lively type I had never encountered before. Since I didn't have many hobbies, I mostly talked about shoes, but she seemed to like my craftsmanship, and our marriage was quickly arranged. My mother decided to live alone at her old home. She cared about me, saying, since I come to the workshop every day, it's fine with her for me to drop by her place occasionally. My wife and I moved to an apartment about 15 minutes from the workshop. At first, my wife was kind, but after about 6 months, she changed. She found my quiet nature boring and complained daily about the lack of excitement. She never visited the workshop or my mother.
Could you visit my mother sometimes? It would make her happy.
I don't get along with your mother. The house feels gloomy, and it doesn't suit me. Since the workshop is next door, you can visit her.
My mother never complained, but I was worried that she had no one to talk to since my father passed away. I thought my mother would be cheered up just by seeing my bright wife, but I was disappointed by my wife's coldness early in our marriage. In the end, my wife only visited my mother once a year around New Year's. I was a workaholic and not very eloquent, but a few years later, we had a child. A boy. My wife, who had been bored, became engrossed in childcare, often taking our child to the park, out for lunch, and occasionally on trips. She would come home and complain. Not every mother behaves this way, but my wife seemed to have friends who lived in high-rise apartments and constantly felt a hierarchy even within the same neighborhood. 5 years later, we had a second child, a girl. Though I had no time to take the kids out, I made commemorative shoes with their footprints when they started walking. It was the best gift I could give. But my wife scoffed.
What's this? Useless. What's the point of making shoes they'll outgrow in 3 months? Give them more practical gifts.
I felt like my work, which I took pride in, was completely denied. Knowing how my wife really felt, my heart froze. Oblivious to my feelings, my wife became obsessed with dressing our daughter in her preferred clothes and accessories. My wife, influenced by those around her, has also started letting our daughter take lessons in activities like piano and ballet. While she seemed to purely enjoy raising our son, taking him to parks and play centers, she spent extravagantly on our daughter, trying to keep up with other mothers. It was a stark contrast to how she treated our son. My earnings alone couldn't cover these expenses, so she worked part-time at a supermarket to make up the difference. I just focused on making shoes. Shoes made from custom molds become unique to each person. It takes time, but the result is one of a kind. Orders aren't many, but when I finish a pair, it's an indescribable joy. Each pair of shoes has its own story, protecting the customer's feet every day. No one tells these stories, but I feel proud thinking about the foundation they represent. When my son turned 10, he started visiting the workshop occasionally. Watching my meticulous work, my son once said,
"Dad, your job looks really tough."
Since then, my son and I had many conversations in the workshop. On the other hand, my wife and daughter showed no interest in my work and seemed to avoid it. My daughter always grimaced at the sight of my hand's color and wrinkles. Stained with polish and other materials, my hands were far from beautiful, but to me, they were a source of pride. However, when my daughter was 7, she suddenly said,
"Dad, your hands are always dirty. Your job is one of the 3D jobs, isn't it? Dirty, difficult, and demeaning, that's what Mom says."
I felt sad that my wife had no understanding of my work and would say such things to our daughter. One day, when I got home, my wife said,
"Oh, don't come in.
I was puzzled, and she continued,
You're dirty, and the house gets dirty, and you smell. Go to a spa or something."
because of my quiet nature, I could never find the right moment to speak up. I wasn't used to shouting either. So I just say, "All right," and head to the spa every day. Even my daughter started keeping her distance from me. When I knocked on her room, she'd say,
"No way. Dirty Dad can't come in."
my son would scold her on my behalf. My son still visited the workshop after his club activities.
Are you interested?
A little. But I like soccer.
He said with a smile. Although I knew my wife and daughter avoided me, I decided to attend a parents' day at her elementary school once. It was a language arts presentation, and the children were reading their essays. One child's essay boasted about his father. "My dad, who lives in a high-rise, always wears neat clothes and drives to work. He has a cool smile and is always lively. I want to be like him." The essay received applause. Next, it was my daughter's turn. She glanced at me awkwardly and began to read her essay.
"My dad gets off at Grand Central Station every morning. He works at a trading company and travels overseas. Recently, he went to Paris and brought back a mini Eiffel Tower. When I grow up, I want to travel overseas and work using French, just like my dad."
I was stunned. Who was she talking about? Is my job really that embarrassing? That's what I thought, but since I hardly ever went to the school, no one seemed to notice whose father I was. I quietly left the school building. At home, I told my wife about the Parents' Day, and she coldly laughed and said,
You just realized that? You're really slow. Both our daughter and I hate your job. It's dull, doesn't pay well, and is just plain drab. Of course, she envies other fathers' jobs. I tell her to marry well too. What's fun about your job? Why not change careers?
I went to the workshop, feeling dejected, and immersed myself in shoemaking. I was furious. Next door, my elderly mother made sandwiches. That was my only soothing time. My wife and daughter, now a high school junior, seemed to dislike me even more, looking at me like I was something dirty, making my own home feel uncomfortable. When I came home from work, my wife and daughter would be out, and my college-age son often came home late from his part-time job. I couldn't talk to my wife because she was never around. One day, around 10 a.m., I was heading to the workshop when my wife came home. Where have you been?
Why do you care? I hate being around you because your poverty is contagious. Why did I marry someone as depressing as you? Life is so unfair. Give me my life back.
Then she mumbled to herself about someone else living in a high-rise apartment. She was wearing flashy makeup and clothes and smelled of alcohol. It's not okay to be out all night. Who are you with?
Shut up. I have my own life. Leave me alone.
Just then, our daughter came home.
Are you still here? Go to your workshop already.
She was wearing light makeup. What are you doing? Both of you. Shouldn't you be at school? I couldn't hold back and shouted.
It's Founder's Day. I can go wherever I want on my day off. I don't want to hear your lectures.
She shouted back. I realized that anything I said to my rebellious daughter would come back twice as harsh, so I stopped talking. More than that, I was appalled at my wife's morning after attitude and questioned her incredibly selfish behavior until now. My daughter's attitude was also influenced by my wife's actions. I secretly hired a private investigator to look into my wife's activities while I was away. Meanwhile, new orders came in at the workshop, and I became busier. For about 10 days, I worked quietly, went to the spa, and returned to the workshop. Because we hardly saw each other, my son brought me food 3 times. He had managed to find a job and talked about wanting to become a buyer for products someday.
I want to visit shoe workshops in Italy. It'd be great to promote your shoes too, Dad.
He said with a smile. Laughing, I joked, when the time comes, count me in. When I finally finished my work and went to visit my parents' home next door, my mother was sitting in her chair, looking at me. She smiled briefly before peacefully passing away. Someday this would happen, but I couldn't stop crying from the sadness. I regretted not taking more time to cherish her. We held a private family funeral for my mother, and after the funeral, my wife sighed and said,
Why don't you demolish that old house, close the workshop, and change jobs? It's a good opportunity.
I felt the blood drain from my face. What a heartless woman. Around that time, I received the results of the investigation into my wife's behavior. To my shock, she was blatantly having an affair. And that wasn't all. I couldn't believe how selfishly she had been acting. I was devastated, but the only thing that saved me was my work. Work doesn't betray you. That day, I resolved to take my time and make her pay. I then immersed myself in my work. For the first time, I received an order for shoes from overseas. Since I didn't understand Italian, I left the communication to the office staff, but I was thrilled that my skills were recognized, and I worked tirelessly on the shoes I loved. My son's job was going well too, and he was getting married to a woman from his company. I was relieved he found a good partner. He would occasionally visit the workshop. Just like when he was a child, we always talked in the workshop. One day, as I went home to change clothes, I found that my key wouldn't open the door. For a moment, I thought I had made a mistake, but I hadn't. Had she changed the locks? Why? Confused, I called my wife and she answered. The key is broken and the door won't open.
So what? I'm out right now.
Frustrated, I asked again.
I changed it. Your home is the workshop, isn't it? Since we're practically separated, I changed the locks.
She hung up after saying that. I felt my mind go blank. There was only loose change at the workshop. The old house next door had been cleaned out and was up for sale, so I couldn't go there. Where would I sleep tonight? I hadn't eaten either. Why did I have to be treated like this? How much more would she mock me before she was satisfied? After years of having my pride shredded, I made a firm decision. I won't let this slide. I sent a message to my son at work. He called back immediately, and after I explained the situation, he suggested we meet at the station, so I walked there to wait for him. My son arrived, looking angry.
Dad, what's going on?
I needed to pick up clothes for a meeting about a new job tomorrow, but the locks have been changed. I don't understand. Can I stay with you tonight? After hearing about my wife and daughter's countless acts of cruelty, my son was outraged and couldn't believe they were family. I also told him about the results of the investigation into his mother's behavior.
Dad, you should be angrier. This is completely insane.
My son was more furious than I was. Trying to stay calm, I said, I am angry. I won't let this slide. My son must have talked to his wife beforehand, because when we got to their place, she welcomed me warmly. She first offered me a shower, and then dinner. How long had it been since I felt such warmth? Then my son's wife suddenly said, "Let's live together, John." I was surprised and said, "Live together? Are you sure about that?" They both smiled and nodded.
You can commute to the workshop from here. It's not that far. If you're okay with it.
Thank you. My voice trembled. The next day, my son accompanied me to buy a suit and go to the meeting. The meeting went well, and I secured a big job. The work I previously did for an overseas client was well received, and they placed another order. It was an ongoing project, and I was scheduled to go to Italy in 2 months. I had staff to help coordinate, but this time I asked my son for assistance. After some thought, he agreed, as it was work he wanted to do, and we decided to work together. I spent a busy 3 months, and upon returning from Italy, I contacted my wife through a lawyer. She wouldn't respond to my calls. My son and I met with her in the presence of the lawyer. She showed up with a defiant look.
What do you two want?
I told her I wanted a divorce. She laughed and said,
I've been hoping for that. But since you're the one asking, I'll demand alimony.
I was speechless at her audacity, but I calmly handed her the investigation report and photos. They showed her infidelity. She had been with multiple men, from a host at a club to a clerk at the local supermarket, and even our daughter's tutor. She had seduced the tutor to get favorable treatment for our daughter. She had been spending lavishly on the host, frequently visiting the club. When she came home in the morning, it was from a date with the host. The supermarket clerk had already quit, but I found out that my wife had shoplifted and seduced him to avoid punishment. There was more. Before my mother passed away, my wife had made her withdraw money from her pension account, claiming it was for living expenses, and spend it on herself. She had pretended to visit my mother to check on her, but was really just after her money. I was furious. Even when confronted with all this, my wife brazenly said,
It's all lies. You made this up. It's all your fault anyway for not earning enough.
Before I could respond, my son spoke up angrily.
Dad doesn't have a low income. He's made a name for himself with the Smith's Shoes brand. You don't know anything, Mom. He's a top-notch shoemaker, getting orders from overseas. We just went to Italy together. I've watched Dad work diligently since I was a kid. He's someone to be respected.
My wife, looking incredulous, tried to say something. No more excuses. What you've done is enough to get the police involved. We'll be claiming alimony. Leave the house by the end of the week. I had many things to say, but I had no feelings left for her, so I just stated my conclusion.
No way. I'm your wife. What about our daughter?
Finally realizing her situation and my achievements, she looked at me pleadingly, but I felt nothing. I stopped seeing you as my wife a long time ago. I'll respect our daughter's wishes, but what will she think after knowing what you've done? We already talked yesterday. You've strayed from the right path. I won't forgive you. Don't ever show your face again. I found myself shouting louder than ever. Afterward, my wife showed up at my son's house, crying and begging.
I've been raising you all by myself, and now your father's being unreasonable. Can't you say something to him?
But my son cut ties with her.
How can you be so selfish? I don't see you as my mother anymore. We're done. Don't come near this house again. If you try to damage Dad's brand, I won't forgive you.
Abandoned by my son, my wife went to our daughter as her last resort. But even she rejected her, looking at her with disgust.
Seduce my tutor? Do you think I'm that dumb? Or are you just that into men? You're the worst mother. I never want to talk to you again. I'll live with Dad. Go to one of your boyfriends.
Desperate and thinking only about money, my wife came to the workshop and screamed.
I'm entitled to a share of the assets, even if we divorce. If Smith's Shoes is doing well, give me some money.
I thought, what nonsense. Think carefully. You've used up almost all the money I earned. I asked you to save, didn't I? The house is rented. The house my mother lived in is mine by inheritance and not subject to asset division. I didn't take more salary than necessary since I didn't even use it. But I did manage to save a little money myself. That money was saved in an account I set up for the children. If I had let her manage those savings, they'd be gone by now. That's the kind of woman she was. In short, There were hardly any personal assets to divide. This was a result of her poor financial management. She agreed to the divorce, abandoned by the entire family, and lost everything. She moved into a cheap apartment. Her flashy style and behavior had made her the talk of the neighborhood, and now she was living the poor life she despised, with no one talking to her. I decided to make her pay alimony to me from her part-time wages, even though it might take years. She drained my mother's pension, so I knew that if I loosened the reins, she would be careless with money again. In a way, this was a form of mercy. Since she was still the mother of my children, I planned to keep an eye on her from a distance. My daughter, who had been close to her, was deeply shocked to learn the truth about her mother. I decided to live with my daughter. Although my son and his wife kindly invited us to live with them, I couldn't impose on them by bringing my daughter along. We decided to stay in our current apartment and maintain communication with each other. As for me, the business trip to Italy made me realize how vast the world is and that I still have a mission to fulfill. Since then, my trips abroad have increased, and my son has been energetically handling sales. Recently, my daughter has also started to show interest. Shoemaking is a deep and intricate craft. With everyone's help, I want to continue making shoes diligently today as well.